Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting, conscientious emergence. Alright, today is going to be a bit simpler than the last two stages. I'm just going to darken in the darks with the same sort of coral pattern with the ultramarine blue and set it up for the next phase.
Efforts on farming, industry, in science and business that ensure the great majority a way of life that is physically gratifying and spiritually uplifting. The seed of our good fortune had root here.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Republican Dwight David Eisenhower was elected president in 1952 in a landslide win, carried 39 states. The hero of World War II, gentle yet tough, labeling the ongoing Korean War as useless, Eisenhower, the general, would end it and restore American confidence and optimism.
Now we look forward to the future with faith in ourselves, in our country, and in the Creator, who is Father of us all.
And with faith in the most powerful arsenal ever assembled, just 3 days before his election, the U.S. tested its first hydrogen bomb on what had been the island of Alugolab. The 65-ton device was too big to drop by plane. Alugolab burned 6 hours under a mushroom cloud, 100 miles across, and then disappeared forever. Who was this new American president with a grandfather's face? At Potsdam, he had opposed the atomic bombings of Japan. He had pushed hard for a second front to help the Soviets and developed a friendly relationship with Soviet General Zhukov. Stalin held him in high regard.
Генерал Eisenhower очень знаменитый человек, не только потому, что это военный труды, а тоже потому, что он добрый и откровенный человек.
He was the first foreigner to ever witness a parade in Red Square from the platform atop Lenin's tomb. And 6 weeks after his inauguration in March 1953, a fresh opportunity presented itself. Americans woke to the news that Joseph Stalin was dead. Despite his extraordinary brutality, most Russians revered him for leading the nation to victory over the Nazis and turning a backward Russia into a modern industrial state. While the public mourned, the new, somewhat uncertain Soviet leaders, freed of the onerous ghost of a man who ruled their lives like an ancient czar for 30 years, decided to ease tensions with the capitalist West. They wanted, above all, to focus on improving their quality of life at home and called for coexistence and peaceful competition. How would America's new leadership respond? Winston Churchill, re-elected a second time to office in 1951, had now seen 50 years of international diplomacy, from the golden age of the European empires to the horrifying rise of fascism. But this new nuclear age held a special terror for the old man. He urged Washington to seize this unprecedented opportunity and pressed for an international summit with the new Soviet leaders. He had hopes for Eisenhower. 6 weeks went by. Silence. And then Eisenhower eloquently spoke of peace.
This is not a way of life at all. And then you see them. Under the cloud of threatening war is humanity hanging from across a line.
The Soviets, inspired, reprinted the speech widely. But then, 2 days later, an answer came back to Moscow from Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. The peace offensive was a peace defensive, taken in response to U.S. strength, and the communists were endlessly conspiring to overthrow from within every genuinely free government in the world. It was insulting, and the Soviets were perplexed, wondering whether it was the moderate Eisenhower or hardline Dulles who spoke for this new administration. The son of a Presbyterian minister, Dulles had made a career on Wall Street in the 1920s and 30s as a lawyer for the corporate to protecting U.S. business interests or in his hatred for communism. Despite his later vehement denials of any dealings with the Nazis, he worked for banker clients and helped secure more than $1 billion in German bond sales in the U.S. He also dealt extensively with the IG Farben Corporation, a significant contributor to the Hitler regime. Dulles was set on the idea of an aggressive liberation of citizens under Soviet control.
Everywhere I look around the world, the question is, what maybe we're going to lose next, you know, and we seem to be on the defensive, and that they're on the offensive.
By this time, the Korean police action had become a 2.5-year nightmare. Brutal land war casualties and endless maneuvers for useless hillsides as elusive as the jungles of South Vietnam 15 years later. Battling Soviet-trained and equipped North Koreans, World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur had pushed north towards the Chinese border, despite repeated warnings from Beijing, assuring Truman that the Chinese would never enter the war. In the late fall of 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops streamed across the Yalu River, sending U.S. and Allied forces reeling backwards in a frantic retreat.
Marines who spearheaded the breakout did not consider it a retreat. Retreat, hell, said their commander. We're just advancing in a different direction.
Time magazine called it the worst defeat the U.S. had ever suffered. Truman wrote in his diary, World War III is here. MacArthur repeatedly and Truman separately threatened to use the bomb. General Curtis LeMay volunteered to direct the attacks, and unknown to the public, American and Soviet pilots were engaging in direct air warfare, the only extended combat between the two sides during the Cold War. The drama of Truman firing MacArthur for insubordination.
General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
And the shock of seeing their all-powerful military failing to defeat ill-equipped Chinese peasants drove Truman's popularity to a record low with the public of 22%. No victory in sight, the UN forces pounded month after month the North and the South with massive, unrelenting conventional air bombing, similar to the campaign visited upon Japan 5 years earlier. Weapon of choice was napalm. Almost every major city in North Korea was burned to the ground, and little was left standing in the South. Although Mao Zedong was imagining a worldwide conflict, Stalin in the summer of 1951 pushed the North Koreans to the bargaining table, but negotiations dragged on for 2 more years.
What are we talking about? What are we arguing about? You know that this insignificant little hill is of no importance to you and no importance to us. How can it be worth any man's life? Don't you feel some responsibility towards thousands of...
Despite some progress at the negotiations and the Soviet peace initiative after the death of Stalin, Eisenhower now threatened to widen the war. He suggested to his commanders that the Kaesong area in North Korea might be a good place to showcase America's new tactical atomic bombs. The Joint Chiefs and National Security Council endorsed atomic attacks on China. Eisenhower and Dulles made sure the communist leaders knew of these threats. The U.S. also began bombing the dams near Pyongyang, North Korea, causing enormous floods and destroying the rice crop. The Nuremberg Tribunal had condemned similar actions by Nazis in Holland in 1944 as a war crime. With casualties skyrocketing on both sides, an armistice was finally signed in July of 1953, dividing the country exactly where the war had begun 3 years earlier. The U.S., despite claims of stopping communism, was perceived as having lost because it had not won. Vice President Richard Nixon would later insist that Eisenhower's nuclear threats had worked brilliantly, teaching him the value of unpredictability, and inspired Nixon's own madman thesis, which he applied to Vietnam less than 20 years later. What was clear was the message to Asians who tried to challenge U.S. interests. Some 3 to 4 million Koreans lay dead out of a population of 30 million, 10%, as well as over 1 million Chinese and 36,000 Americans. China had stood up proudly to the Americans, as the Vietnamese later would, enhancing their international prestige. And America would block China's entry to the United Nations until 1971. The Soviets, by comparison, looked weak, widening their gulf with China. As for the U.S., it was Churchill who grasped the real meaning.
Korea does not really matter now. I've never heard of the bloody place until I was 74. Its importance lies in the fact that it has led to the rearming of America.
The defense budget had grown 4 times to almost $50 billion, and military spending would hover at more than 50% of the U.S. budget for the rest of the 1950s. Under Eisenhower, a permanent war economy was to be achieved. Put another way, it was not just General Motors that was good for America. Anti-communism was good for business. During his campaign, Eisenhower had in fact done little to lower the Cold War temperature, fanning the flames of anti-Sovietism with calls to move beyond the Democrats' containment to a Republican liberation of the Eastern Bloc. Although he despised the venomous anti-communist Wisconsin Senator,
There we go.
Joe McCarthy,
Now when that's reglazed, that will show off as a nice texture and give it more depth for the overall shadow areas. I don't know if I got enough time to do much anything else right now without clipping another segment onto it. I guess I could do the sun again real quick. I'm gonna work on that top portion. But I might just leave it be, let it all dry, and move on to something else today. Or just sit down with the cat and we'll think about it. That's it for the moment though, I think. So I'm going to take this off the tripod, so I'll get a different angle and take the glare off. Alright, there we go. So that's the next layer on this. And that's it for the moment, so have a good day, Earth. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting, conscientious emergence.